get started. Welcome to the third seminar in the school's spring series. We're very fortunate to have Aogán Mulcahy talking to us about his research on travellers in our society, travellers in your society.
And the police.
I'll hand over to Aogán.
Thanks. I'm sorry none of you had anything better to do on a Friday afternoon than be here, but so be it. We're all in this together. In case I get lost along the way, could happen, has happened before, the end point really is just to try and emphasize the depth of marginalisation of travellers in respect of policing and justice issues in particular, and also to try to demonstrate ultimately that the manner in which travellers engage with the police and vice versa is mediated really through issues relating to space, territory, and so on. And ultimately, I think what that calls for in terms of improving those relations is a set of measures that really lie beyond the responsibility of the police alone, which obviously raises difficult issues in terms of debates about police reform, but also, of course, about the responsibility of different branches of government, local government particularly. What I want to do is go through, first of all, some material about travellers in Irish society, and then change tack and look in particular at how travellers come to be seen in fairly unequivocal ways as a problem population, and how the police response to this is very much in terms of different measures of strategies of spatial regulation. Just in terms of some background information, the last census gave a figure of about 22,500. Other estimates suggest that travellers might comprise a population of perhaps 30,000. But give or take, we're talking about perhaps 0.5% of the Irish population. We're talking also about a community characterised historically by nomadism. About perhaps 95% of travellers are based in urban areas at this stage. A significant majority are settled. But nomadism, whether continual or sporadic, remains a key characteristic, even if it's a historical issue rather than necessarily a contemporary one. And I've put there as a distinctive ethnic group in terms of what most people would use as a standard definition of ethnicity, different norms, cultural practices, language, and so on. The key issue, though, in terms of any discussion about travellers, I think, has to be in terms of the marginalised position they occupy. And if you look at any quality of life index, you find an enormous disparity between the settled population, including any different branches of it, and travellers in respect of a whole host of measures of quality of life, which sounds a little bit too leisurely, but really how long people live, how much pain they suffer, how much income they have. I think in terms of the number of levels of child mortality, a proportion of children who die in the first year of after birth, the numbers are significantly higher in terms of life expectancy. I think a gap or a differential of about 10 or 12 years between travellers and the settled population. And also, of course, not just the expectancy, the life expectancy of travellers, but also, again, the quality of life they enjoy or perhaps endure would be a better term in terms of health ailments and educational qualifications and so on. In 1986, David Rothman and his colleagues said the circumstances of the Irish travelling people are intolerable. No humane and decent society, once made aware of such circumstances, could permit them to persist. Now, Rothman was either wrong, or else Irish society is not a humane and decent place. When we and it's important to tip the hat to the author here, when McGrail's social distance survey was conducted in 72 and 73. Travellers were ranked 52nd out of 59 social categories. In terms of social history, I think there's a small study in itself to be done in terms of the categories of people ranked beneath travellers: communists, gay people, Sinn Féin, Hare Krishna, people with AIDS, drug addicts, and the Provisional IRA. What's interesting, though, is that the standing, in a follow-up study in the late 1980s, the standing of travellers diminishes further. And we find a decline from 29% to 16%, of people who would welcome travellers into their family through marriage. So kind of a standard measure of how much do you like this group of people, how willing are you to sit around a table with them, how willing are you to allow yourself or them to be seen in the same terms as you. McGrail went on to describe this precariously low standing as an extremely disturbing and deteriorating position. He described travellers on the basis of these findings as an almost untouchable caste. Again, he argued, or he stated, that it was difficult to comprehend how attitudes of the kinds he demonstrated could be so negative. A couple of other surveys investigating similar issues have revealed similar and perhaps sometimes more negative findings. A study by Citizen Traveller in, I think, 2000 or 2001, again found a huge level of unease about the very concept of travellers being part of your family circle. One question was, I think something like 10% of respondents suggested that citizenship should be denied to travellers. So those really are that's in rough terms the chasm. We're not talking about a slight gap. We're talking about a chasm, a gaping, yawning chasm. Now, how do we explain this? Well, first of all, I think we have to recognize that there's been a significant ongoing erosion of many of the traditional sources of livelihood that travellers would have enjoyed. The advent of the plastic age, the mechanization of farming, and so on. But it also, I think, coincides with a change in characterization of travellers, in particular an increasing level of association not just with crime, but in particular with significant serious crime. And I think this can be captured simply in this notion of travellers being disorderly and unruly, but now being disorderly, unruly and criminogenic. In terms of looking at, I suppose, a set of wider concerns, in terms of looking at a set of wider concerns, the issue of place, I think, comes to the fore when we consider historically the position that travellers would have occupied. I think it's pretty much an understatement to say that they were out of place in the nationalist political project that consumed so much energy in the first decades after independence. Certainly the moral order that was promoted was one of stable communities, homogeneous communities, orderly communities, pious communities, restrained communities. And one obvious point of comparison was characterizations of travellers. The idea that they could only come together in situations of excess. Every opportunity for a gathering, every fair, every festival was an opportunity for violence, for disorder, for a whole host of concerns. This was the critique. But also, the very fact of being a transient population also, I think, clashes significantly with what in Ireland is an undeniable cultural and political emphasis upon place, upon land. It's reflected in Ireland having the highest levels of home ownership in Europe, but it's also reflected in political policies that were put in place to, I think in Tom Garvin's words, he says that political debate in the first decades after independence was focused very much on the cow or the plough and the perpetual problem of how to settle as many people on the land as possible. So this wasn't just an abstract idea, it also was a specific goal. And it wasn't just a goal in Irish terms. As far as modernity is concerned and I suppose the consolidation of states, that really is based on sedentarism on stability, and stability in particular places. McVeigh says that in this way, nomadism generally is a problem in many countries, insofar as the political and cultural resistance of nomads continues to subvert deep-seated beliefs about the normalcy of settlement and wage labour and private property which pervade, the whole of sedentary society. Now, this problem population, as far as land is concerned, was addressed initially through the tried and trusted means of ignoring travellers. They featured remarkably little in many political discussions, up until the probably 1980s, when strategies of assimilation began to gather weight. And the difficulty with travellers within official discourse was really their reluctance to settle, and how could they be made to settle? This was the solution to the problem. And in effect, they had made themselves remote from government services, they had made themselves remote from the supports of the welfare state by preferring a life of transience as opposed to all of the integration into state institutions that stability would enable them to get. So assimilation meant settlement. The strategy for achieving settlement was essentially devolved to local authorities. Local authorities wanted this like they wanted a hole in their head. So in effect you had responsibility for settlement falling to local authorities, and the most vocal critics of settlement policies often were local councillors acting on behalf of representing the views of residents' associations, their constituents, and so others. And this is why when visitors come to Ireland, they're so perplexed at this enormous love Irish people have of boulders. Other people break them up and use them for infill or for, garden paths. But boulders are cherished in Irish society. They're often put in prominent places where people can view them with, short people, because if you're very tall, you won't be able to get under the barricade that goes into the car park as well. We also have, of course, more recently the shift in the offence of trespass from a civil to a criminal offence. And ultimately, and again, this is going at a fair pace through a very complex history, we find a situation that even at the turn of the century, we still find a situation where a significant minority of travellers live in conditions that are basic. And we're not talking about basic in the sense of unglamorous, we're talking about basic in the sense of conditions that would be, if they were transposed onto the settled population, would be considered a sheer humiliation. So, what did this mean in terms of involvement of travellers with the criminal justice system? Well, initially, travellers were accorded a very dubious status, but it was a status based very much on the issue of nuisance, on being out of place, on being a bit of a headache, a bit of a problem, but not necessarily a serious problem, an enduring problem, and a headache, but the war of the flea, basically, an irritant rather than a crisis. The Minister for Justice, 1945, said travel tickers are a nuisance. They give trouble in some areas, but I don't think they're a very big problem yet. The police have instructions to pay special attention to them. In 1963, the Commission on Itinerancy describes the concerns about constant begging, petty pilfering, trespass and damage in rural areas, drunkenness, noisiness, and brawling when they get together. You don't really see a huge emphasis upon crime, particularly serious predatory crime, in those various characterizations. But yet they filtered into relations with the settled population. Again, in the Commission's words, in terms of the prevalence of feelings of bitter hostility, often accompanied by fear. In nearly all areas, itinerants are despised as inferior beings and are regarded as the dregs of society. Now, ironically, there's been more stuff written about the involvement, whether as victims or offenders, of travellers in the criminal justice system in Britain than in Ireland. But I think that says a lot right there. But some information is available, and if we look at 1962, we find that travellers comprise 22% of all prison committals. In other words, in terms of individuals who went into custody for a year, for 10 years, or for a day, the volume of people that went into custody, they comprised a fifth, even though they comprise half of 1% of the population. Nowadays in criminology there's a significant discussion about mass imprisonment, in particular the hugely disproportionate involvement of young black men in the States in having significant prison terms, serving significant prison terms. And yet in that year we find that about 1/8 of travellers over the age of 14 were committed to prison, right? So we're talking about a fairly phenomenal, now there's details missing there, obviously, the duration, the offences, the convictions and so on, but we're talking about a level of involvement with the criminal justice system that, if applied to the population as a whole, would be a crisis. And it would be a crisis in terms of resources, but it would also be a crisis, I think, in terms of what the hell is going on. And it's interesting too, I think, that broad shift in emphasis on nuisance, minor disorder, causing problems when coming together, brawling, noisiness. More recently, that of course has become associated, or travellers have become associated, particularly in commentary and so on, with the shift from petty to predatory crime. Now, changing gears a bit and talking about policing, what issues would this raise as far as policing is concerned? Well, first of all, we have to consider that policing isn't necessarily about law enforcement, but really it's about information. It's about gathering, collating, processing, disseminating information. And in many ways, one of the puzzles of policing is the puzzle of non-enforcement. We have people who are trained in legal powers. They have a raft of legislation to draw on. They are trained. The public expect them surely to investigate crime, to arrest someone, to charge someone, all with a view to securing a conviction. In reality, a better way to characterize policing is as a diverse activity, law enforcement being one arm of it, service provision being another, but probably order maintenance comprising the largest policing activity. And this policing activity is done very much within specific spatial contexts, and it's very much reflected. The underpinning spatial element of policing is reflected in the police mandate, which is to maintain order, which by definition has a spatial component. You control someone in a particular context, in a particular room, in a particular building, right? It's reflected in terms of core police activities, what many people consider to be the core police activity, which is patrol. And what's patrol except surveillance, except keeping an eye on a particular beat. And a beat is a neighbourhood, is a territory, and so on. And of course also just at a wider level of abstraction, it's simply surveillance. But it's also, I think, that concern about the spatial element of policing is also reflected in police culture, where one of the key components, and this seems to be reasonably universal according to the different studies of policing, is the element of suspicion. The idea that one of the tasks of policing is to determine, who are you, what are you doing, and so on. And of course that issue of who are you and what are you doing really has to be understood again in terms of a specific spatial element. It's always what are you doing here, okay? Always, always, always. And of course that is accompanied by a moral dimension as well. This is not simply a description, it's who should be here, should you be here, and so on. That underpins everything. Now, as far as order maintenance policing is concerned, the significance, I think, really is that it's an activity that is most often applied to marginal populations. And in many ways, when people express concerns about police accountability mechanisms, they often assume some kind of, level of allegiance that police officers don't really investigate police officers. One of the reasons why you find such low levels of substantiated complaints is because of the characteristics of policing. In many ways, policing is often characterized as low visibility activity. In other words, you do it on your own. You do it without people necessarily, following you around with cameras with lots of witnesses. And you often do it against populations that in the eyes of wider society and even in the judicial system are compromised. They're marginal. They're problem categories to deal with. Jolie, in 1981, famous paper, talked about the category of police property. That in many ways order maintenance policing is really directed towards a specific strata of the population. And he says a category becomes police property when the dominant powers of society and the economy, policy, etc., when they leave the problems of social control of that category to the police. Let the police deal with these. Niggers, queers, hippies, travellers would fit very well in there. Okay? And the notion of police property implies not just an excess of police attention, that the police specifically target these groups because of this expectation, because of this reputation, but also that it's done on behalf of, or with the tacit support of, at the very least, the wider population. In other words, the wider population leaves it to the police to deal with this. They're your problem now, you deal with them, however you think fit. We won't bother you with scrutiny, we won't bother you with concerns about this. So, how does this relate to travellers? Well, first of all, travellers would comprise, in Ireland, probably the definitive category of police property. Speaking with police officers, many of them are keen, as many people in various institutional roles do, to focus on individual instances. And they say that, well, we don't treat a category, we deal with people within that, or even subcategories within that. The decent versus the gougers, the reputable versus the disreputable, and so on. So clearly there are nuances, and those have to be taken seriously. But equally, what's fundamentally clear is that the level of antagonism and distrust between police and travellers is profound. One officer I interviewed during the interview I asked about relations with travellers, and some bland, banal comment was offered as soon as the tape recorder was switched off. I'll tell you about police and travellers. Oh, a lot of guys, they really dislike travellers. I mean, they really dislike them. You know, they give them a nervous tick, and a very plausible nervous tick emerged. Another person referred to an effort by a superior officer to not have police officers refer to travellers as knackers, okay, a term of abuse by and large. And some officers got around this by referring to travellers as stills, on the basis that travellers are still knackers. Okay. So we find, and those are obviously just some minor examples, but we find a base level of mistrust. We also find, in terms of the police's role as information workers, travellers comprise a specific problem, and they comprise a problem in various respects. First of all, I think it's immediately apparent that nomadism undermines the police requirements concerning information, gathering information provision, and also, of course, the police role is the guardianship of specific territories. This is my patch, and so on. And so the idea that the police might somehow thwart the surveillance requirements of policing is something that consumes many police officers. So they're particularly problematic. Why? You need a special unit really to deal with them. You would really keep track of them, because if they're moving all the time, how do you police someone with no address? The field, Tala? You never really think of addresses being so prominent, so essential, and yet, lo and behold, in policing terms, they are. How do we find them? Now this suggests, of course, that all travellers travel, and that all travellers travel invisibly almost, like spirits across the land. Clearly that's not the case. Even travellers who do travel, they often travel from recognised site to recognised site to recognised site. And I defy any organisation that really wants to find people, if you were looking for a series of caravans moving together, that you wouldn't be able to find them. I would have thought it actually would be relatively easy to find. What can be difficult to find are people in private places, hidden behind doors, but when you're actually travelling on public roads the police have ready access to, I would have thought that actually wasn't such a particular problem. But this difficulty in terms of information provision is compounded again by the issue of moral disdain as expressed through concerns about ingrained traveller dishonesty. The idea that travellers are deceitful to the core. But either they're compulsive liars to the point of not even telling you their name, or they will tell you their name, but someone else's name. Oh, someone has 12 names. Oh my God, I need one name on one form. I am an information worker. You are making my life a misery. and misery, I think, would be an understatement in terms of capturing the frustration that many police officers feel. Not just in Ireland. Probably any police force in the world will tell you they're the most frustrating people to deal with. Truth just goes out the door. They don't trust anyone in officialdom. They're very difficult to police, absolutely. Georgia, the state of Georgia at one stage issued a warning about travellers, about their dishonesty, that they will show up to offer to do your roof, but they won't. Beware travellers. So, what does this actually mean in terms of specific relations? You've got two separate tables here, okay? So the first, these are police officers, this is part of the Human Rights Audit in 2004 published, okay? Now you've got different categories here. I won't even comment on the breakdown of the different categories, but lo and behold, different sets of respondents. I'd say different categories, okay? And how do police officers think that police as a whole, the overall relationship with these groups is? Is it good? Is it okay? Is it poor? You will find that the lowest level of good is for travellers, the highest level of poor. And that's in terms of how guards think the overall relationship is with these different groups. When you look at guards' individuals, their assessments of their own individual relationships with these groups, again, we find that travellers have the almost the lowest, faith groups, daringly, but we find they have the highest level of poor relationships. Now these are marginally better than these. Again, who doesn't think, well, that's all to talk about groups is to misrepresent things. Really, you have to look at individuals. So there's always that gap, I think, between the organisation and the individual. But what we do see is evidence of a chasm, okay? And travellers, the police view their relations with travellers as the worst relations they have with any other group. Now, these are just general survey findings, again, studies conducted by the police, erratically initially, but then annually from 2002 onwards. So in terms of overall public satisfaction with the police, okay, we find 89%, which by the way is, in international terms, a phenomenal outcome. It really is quite bizarre. You have to wonder what's going on there. We find at the turn of the century a drop, but still, and these would be about maybe 10 percentage points higher than corresponding surveys in other countries, okay? But we still find a level that internationally would be very high. So 81% in the most recent surveys. Now those are general national surveys. When we look at a survey that the Garda Research Unit did in 2007, overall satisfaction with the police in terms of travellers, migrants and refugees, we find, instead of 81%, we find 52%. 52% of travellers surveyed claimed that they were satisfied with the policing they received. We find this is significantly lower than the migrants they surveyed, 91%, don't ask me what's going on there, or 92%, is that not right? There are methodological issues here we won't even go into, right? But think of it, 48%, not just being dissatisfied, but almost half and half, dissatisfied and very dissatisfied, as opposed to 3 and 1, and so on. So we're talking about a level of general public satisfaction that's extraordinarily high, even perhaps in slight decline, but still extraordinarily high in comparative terms. When we look at travellers, this is the scale. This is the scale of the chasm. If you look at any of the surveys, that I think is the lowest level of satisfaction of any group, as far as public satisfaction, confidence in the police is concerned in Ireland. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with the issue of trying to explain in specific terms the relationship between policing and travellers. And to recognise that I think the key dynamic is really issues relating to space and the regulation of activity in spatial contexts. Fundamentally, I think the issue being moved on, which is very much at the core of traveller identity, this underpins so much of relations between police and travellers. So just a couple of quotes there. The guards come out and they were saying, come on, you have to move on, you have to move on. And I just remember even at 14 years of age thinking it was very odd that these guards were coming out and that they were treating us like shit. Another interviewee, evictions were frequently fairly violent, I suppose, as well, and emotionally, I suppose, in terms of your whole life being destroyed in one piece and no care being taken for it. And then a more generic concern about being moved on. So those are when the first two quotes are really when you're moved from one area of residence, let's put it, to another. But there is a more generic one, which I'll talk about on the next slide as well. But it's either the guards coming to evict you, or it's the guards coming to remove you out of the pub or premises or a shop or wherever it would be. And it's always in relation to discrimination or racism in most cases that travellers have contact with the guards. There are some instances of feud fighting and that kind of stuff where the guards come in and intervene, but the majority of times because people are being removed because they're travellers on a premises, or they're being evicted from a site, and the guards come and do it. So the policing strategies, are you still reading that, or will I plow on? Plow on? I'll take your silence as I sent. The policing strategies then become, on the one hand, containment. And this really is the title of the paper. One guard saying relations with travellers are generally pretty good. Travellers are all right in their own place. They're easily dealt with there. The idea that halting sites and traveller encampments really become what Keith described, and Kenneth Newman, once the Commissioner of London met, described as symbolic locations, where in a sense what happens here has a huge impact on relations between those residents, those people, that population, and the police. He was talking about race riots in London, that the activities of the police at specific key moments, in specific high-profile locations, had an inordinate impact on the wider perceptions of the community. But significantly, halting sites and encampments, they become places where, in a sense, the rules, the procedures of policing can be more easily applied. These are places where more widespread public scrutiny is not in evidence, and where perhaps the rules of policing come to be applied more informally than formally. One case of this perhaps might be in the recent Morris Tribunal reports, which surely will sober up even the drunkest person. But one case involves some guards planting a shotgun on a traveller site in Donegal, with the view to then using this as the basis for arresting and detaining some travellers to ask them about another offence. But the idea that, well, what will we do? Well, we'll plant a shotgun. Right? Now those, I think that specific example is perhaps extreme, but certainly some of the travellers interviewed for this project referred to such things as the speed at which guards drove through halting sites and so on. Even something as basic as that, the idea that standard rules, protocols, procedures were, in a sense, suspended in relation to these particular sites. But you also then have a policing strategy of displacement. And here we come back, I think, to that notion of travellers as police property. The idea that police action towards travellers was motivated by and mobilised by the requests of the settled population. That in effect travellers were policed at the behest of the settled population. So different guards, one saying you didn't bother with them unless someone complained. Another one saying when travellers would come into an area, the local residents would ring up and the guards would go down and ask, where are you going to be staying tomorrow night? Another guard described the purpose of police intervention as to make travellers someone else's problem. We've got you tonight, do send us a postcard from wherever you're going tomorrow night. You'll be someone else's problem then, and you will then be moved on and on and on, all very predictably. What does this mean? Well, it means that in some ways this is entirely familiar from the policing literature in terms of police relationships with marginalised communities. On the one hand, it's too much, the familiar criticism of over-policing, but on the other hand, it's too little, the familiar criticism of under-policing. And so we find in terms of under-policing the idea of failing to intervene. The idea that what happens in traveller sites, well, not just will the rules of policing be loosely applied, but sometimes they mightn't even be applied at all. And so if there's a problem, well, you deal with it, you sort it out. We're not going to. This has implications in turn for the role of feuds. Okay, feuds as self-help in Donald Black's phrase, right? So you have that under-policing, the failure to take, in other words, the crime of travellers seriously, but in this case, more significantly, the victimization of travellers. To take the victimization of travellers seriously. We also have then and probably this is the more familiar response, the idea that the police intervene excessively. There's a complaint and 20 of them come. You also have the idea related to that when the police come, they don't just come to respond to the specific event, but to use it as a more general trawling exercise, to see what they can find. And in particular, to see what they can find in terms of the car and insurance stuff. We've come for a complaint in relation to a brawl, a fight, domestic violence, who knows what. But while we're here, we'll just have a look at the cars. Okay? So you have, in terms of travellers, obviously a disincentive to call the police if it's simply going to, even to respond to your predicament personally, you may be visiting negative consequences upon your neighbours and the community around you as a whole. What does this mean? It means that one of the interesting things about travellers is the level of concern that exists in relation to domestic violence. I think one of the recent surveys found that perhaps half of the admissions, and if someone has read this, correct me, but some incredibly high amount of admissions to shelters in Ireland were traveller women and their children. Okay? So an enormous problem in relation to domestic violence. Talking to police and travellers, the issue of drugs comes up again and again, and also, of course, feuds. What's significant, though, is that the victimization of travellers, in terms of all of these heightened debates about travellers and crime, the victimization of travellers comes up so minimally. And feuds tend to be characterised as a problem insofar as they spill over into settled society. Oh my God, the McDonoughs and the Joyces are knocking lumps out of each other. We hope it won't spill over into and affect decent people. This really is the subtext, and sometimes it's not even the subtext. It's the words that are shouted most in the shrillest tones. So one Garda, when he was confronted with some of the Garda Research Unit findings about fear of crime and travellers, he said, I'd never actually thought of travellers being afraid of crime before. Those travellers were characterised as these almost primitive types. You know, their senses weren't as fully developed as the contemporary namby-pamby modern subject. Oh, I'm so reflexive, I just constantly am concerned about my safety and my security and my person. Travellers, on the other hand, almost this sense of primitive. We don't suffer fear. You know, we do things too. We're not afraid of anyone. You know, this really quite striking characterization. But also, one traveller woman said she asked one Garda why guards don't come onto campsites more. The guard said, well, because basically we're afraid. We're afraid. And why do we show up in 20? Because we're afraid if we show up on our own, there'll be an incident and we'll get lumps kicked out of us and no one will come to our assistance, and so on the basis that the uniform means nothing to them. That was one of the quotes. The uniform means nothing to them. They'll take you on. And she said to him, well, you know, you're a big, strong guard, big, strapping fella, and you're scared of coming on a traveller site. How do you think I feel living on a traveller site where the police won't actually come? Okay? So that issue of victimization and fear is something that's very pervasive, but politically becomes very difficult to articulate, precisely because it's seen as feeding into the wider public and political concerns expressed about travellers and crime. So we're approaching the end. Thank you so far. What does all this mean? Well, first of all, just in terms of travellers and the police in the new Ireland, i.e. the still relatively low levels of diversification, but more than before. So what policing initiatives were introduced? A variety. The Garda Racial and Intercultural Unit set up. A series of ethnic liaison officers appointed around the country to ensure that, you know, issues relating to ethnicity and diversity could be dealt with knowledgeably and reasonably. the Irish language proficiency test. Previously, you didn't have to be Irish to join the Guards, but you had to speak Irish and English, which was in effect a nationality test in everything but name. This was changed, so now you can be, you have to speak Irish or English, which the idea that someone would speak Irish and not English, I suppose there may be one or two. But anyway, the policing agenda, the diversity agenda, as far as it's been rolled out in Ireland, and this very much conforms to the international experience, has been organised, I think, around issues relating to police culture in particular, and issues of representation. How can we increase recruitment? How can we target unhelpful attitudes within the ranks of the Garda Síochána? How can we make sure that language training and awareness and attentiveness to issues of cultural diversity are at the forefront of the minds of guards? And the targeting has very much been on new communities, new migrant communities. So, for instance, after the change in the language requirement, there was a recruitment round, and about, I think, 800, give or take, applications, 588 Chinese applicants, 7 travellers, as far as I can make out. So what does all this mean? It really means that the scale of issues in relation to crime and policing, and the scale of concerns relating to them, is vast. It means that the marginal status is reflected in and confirmed by issues relating to accommodation and settlement. It means that the role of the police in addressing those issues is profound and has marked police-traveller relations for decades. And it also means that to improve relations between the police and travellers means a solution that necessarily has to extend beyond targeting the culture of would-be racist officers, and instead looking at the wider political field within which travellers are situated. And that means, I think, looking for solutions more within the sphere of government, central government certainly, but local government in particular. So, Sinead? This one? Yeah.
I've got the role of discussing, but there's going to be a lot of questions, so I'll keep it short. It might be coming a little bit out of left field, and Aogán, you might just sort of say, "Oh, that's not the paper I wanted to write, and it's something different." But I'll throw it in anyway. 2 things. The first is I'm curious about how the way in which travellers are policed fits into a literature that you know better than I do, which is all about the kind of broader changes that people claim have taken place in the way crime is understood and the way it's managed in contemporary liberal societies. The sort of shift to kind of managing crime as opposed to actually preventing it in some ways, or towards trying to prevent it through the way in which you design space, right? So you prevent crime not by improving the locks on your doors, but by building gated communities. So it's not possible. It's not, in fact, physically possible for a criminal to come anywhere near your house. That kind of thing. So how does this kind of story relate to those broader debates? Is this a kind of an exception to that kind of development that's supposed to be taking place in places like the US and the UK and so on? And I was thinking specifically of your concept of police property, because in one sense what all this literature is arguing is that the tendency has been away from that, right, of treating crime and criminality, of trying to shift it to become towards being regarded as the property of all of us, right, of the whole community, and not just the police, right, so that people are meant to take more responsibility for their own safety, their own security in relation to crimes like that. And it's possible that this is in fact an exception to that kind of story, and that would be really interesting. The other thing that I thought of is what I always throw in is the comparative point. Of course, how does the way in which travellers are dealt with in Ireland relate to the policing of similar kinds of communities in different countries and in different kind of political settings. Is the Irish story exceptional, or are there kind of connections with the way it works in different settings? Again, the one thing that really struck out for me, that stood out for me in what you were talking about, was the relationship to land and property. Because it sounds like what you were saying was that it's the settled population that's seen as having a thought through, intimate, kind of thorough relationship to their property, whereas travellers are constructed as having a fairly superficial kind of relationship to land. Now, there'll be other kind of situations where that's not the way in which things are configured, and it's precisely the nomadic population that actually sees itself as having a stronger kind of emotional attachment to land, and it's the settled population that's seen as having a fairly superficial, instrumental relationship to it.